Hey Elise, so because we missed your conference yesterday, I'm just going to do the same thing in this screencast so you can sort of follow along with um, my thoughts and reactions to your writing, and you can make the necessary changes from there. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have after the fact. And once you feel like you have gotten the feedback that you'd need from the video, I will delete it off of my YouTube channel. Okay, so here we go. The first thing is that your heading looks good, except that the month of January actually needs spelled out. So that's just to keep it formal and professional. The second thing is to make sure that the whole thing is double spaced, because your spacing up here looks different than your spacing down here, and it needs to be uniform. And the last thing about the setup is that you should have a title. So think about something, and it can be sort of witty, or it can be very formal. So think about what your title might be. Okay, so here we go. India was often referred to as the crown jewel by the British Empire because it possesses many rich natural resources and long-established trading posts. Until 1858, the subcontinent of India was ruled by the British East India Company, and because of the harsh taxes and requirements to sell I think it needs to be goods, at lower prices to the company, Indian industrialists were unable to compete with manufacturers in Manchester and Birmingham, and were put out of business. British manufacturers began to produce and export textiles for the mass Indian market, pushing the middle class to collapse and increasing the unemployment of many skilled artisans in that area that once exported the majority of textiles into the world. Although the British East India Company was put out of power in 1858, the new British Raj continued to put laws into place that suppressed the Indians. The oppressive rule of the British stripped India of its economic, political, and cultural independence, which in turn led to conflict in India and the push for independence. Okay. In 1857, Indian Revolt was the reason why the British took control of India from the British East India Company. This revolt broke out due to rumors that the British began to use sacred animal fat, pig and cow, to coat cartridge shells, which infringed on the religions of the Indian soldiers, who were mostly Muslims and Hindi. On top of the rage over these rumors, Indian soldiers were also fed up with poor wages, harsh policies, rise of British presence, and army regulations that were perceived as attempts to Christianize the population. The Indian Revolt of 1857 can be referred to as the first war of Indian independence of South Asia, as it marks the solidification of resentment towards the British because of their regulations and policies. Firstly, the British... That transition is a little awkward. Like, what are we counting? I'm not entirely sure why you start off with firstly. I think that might need a little bit more explanation there. It just sort of surprised me. Anyway, the British suppressed India's political freedoms as they seized more control. One way in which the British did this was in 1886, when they introduced the Indian Civil Service, giving them the ability to manage and control the Indian Empire. In addition, the ICS was a way for the British government to ensure their dominance over India through control of those serving in political and professional positions. In the ICS, the most coveted positions, salaries, and opportunities were reserved only for British-born officials, which only gave British-born the opportunity to receive those higher positions. Through agencies like the ICS, the British were able to establish their dominance in India and ensure that only white officials took on important roles in the Indian government. Okay, so when I take a look at this, like, you talk about the Indian Revolt in 1857, but I'm wondering, like, what happened between 1857 and 1886, only because that's a pretty big chunk of time, and I'm not entirely sure, like, if there's something that I need to know about from there. The other thing is that I'm going back into your other paragraphs because you reference ICS. Oh, Indian Civil Service. Okay, so because you then use it as an acronym here, please make sure that right here you put in parentheses ICS, because that will give the reader a hint as to the fact that you're going to start using the acronym. Okay, so now we're right here. On the other side, by 1861, Indians had gained a stronger presence in the electoral process and access to the viceroy through small measures, and by 1909 were granted the right to fill elected positions in government in the Government of Indian Act of 1909. The British government also established colleges and universities that allowed the upper middle class access to European thought and education, giving the impression that sovereignty would eventually be granted. Many Indians believed that independence was now very viable reality. But any significant changes to give Indians more political control were undermined by the declaration of Queen Victoria as the Empress of India, showing the British reluctance to relinquish control of India. You need to make sure that you're capitalizing British. In addition to appointing Queen Victoria as the Empress of India, the British Raj showed that they were not interested in giving the Indians more representation in politics. You need a space here, right there after this. Many political decisions for India continued to be made in the London-based Parliament and through the British-appointed viceroys that ensure the interests of the Crown. Okay. You have a lot of historical summary right now, and I'm not entirely sure where you're going. So you want to think about your reader's experience right now and if all of this background information is necessary. I'm going to start right here. The British also stripped India of its economic independence in addition to their political independence. Before the British Raj came to power, the middle class in India was already beginning to fall as British manufacturers began to export textiles in the Indian market. Because of high taxes placed on Indian industrialists and their requirement to sell their goods to the British East Company at high cost, Indian industrialists could not compete with British ones. Instead, British industrialists took interest and established tea, coffee, and indigo plantations and began to extensively exploit Indian laborers. Through these British economic policies, India was forcibly transformed into an agricultural colony of England. Because of this transformation, India lost its economic independence and became reliant on British manufacturing to fuel their economy. Since India did not have their own industry, they had to rely on selling their agricultural products to India in order to sustain their economy. So they had to, this doesn't make sense. I think you need to clarify this. So India had to sell their agricultural products to themselves to sustain their economy. If that's what you mean, then let's just change a few words here. And India also had to import British textiles, and other manufacturing products since they were not producing the items themselves. So it seems like you are having finding issues about Pakistan and India, okay? These acts of political and economic suppression fueled nationalism in India, beginning with the establishment of the Indian National Congress in 1885. In response to acts of political oppression, the INC was established with the original goal of seeing more locals in political representation. Over time, the INC's leaders began to believe that independence was the only possible way for Indians to gain power over their own affairs. Many leaders of the independent movement emerged from the Congress of INC, such as Mahatma Gandhi, who led the Indian nonviolence movement, and Nehru, who eventually became India's first prime minister. Another significant event was April 13th. Okay, so since you're giving the full date with the year, you should delete the TH there. When British troops fired on peaceful protests in the city of Amritsar. It is estimated that about 1,000 people were killed and another 1,500 were killed. This pushed the remaining population, who was content living under the British Raj, to begin rallying for independence. I'm not entirely sure why you have this extra space right here. During World War I, the INC began to support Britain against the Axis power because they believed that Britain would in turn grant independence in return for their help in the war. So this is a little clunky because you say that Britain would in turn grant independence in return for their help in the war. So I wonder if you could wordsmith that a little bit to get rid of one of those terms. But when Britain did not grant India independence, protests began to break our calling for independence. That needs work. Okay, so I think that some of the historical information is really important, but I'm going back to your thesis where it says, oppressive rule of British stripped India of its economic, political, and cultural independence, which in turn led to conflict in India and the push for independence. So I think you do a good job talking about the economic and political freedoms, but almost too much. I think that what you're really trying to get at, or at least in our conversations, was that independence part. So if you could briefly talk about the economics, briefly talk about the political, and then get into, okay, these things happened. This was the reaction. And then these were the steps that the Indian people took for their independence. I think that would be really helpful to get to the end of your paper, okay? The other thing is I don't see a works cited page, so you for sure want to make sure that you have that. And I'm just going to assume that you're okay with that since I can't give you feedback on it. Anyway, so you have a little bit of work to do. There are some spaces I want you to really clean up with your word choice or like subject-verb agreement. Not that many, but there are a few places. And I guess at this point, if you have questions or you need me to clarify any comments, let me know. And like I said, as soon as you feel like you're pretty good with the feedback, I will delete this video, okay? Have a good night.